Benny, Lino, and Sonia, the four of us, and I had a couple of objects in 1985. And so I've always had something in the building since 1985. But my first show was, November of 87.
Wow.
Yeah, long time ago.
Long time ago.
And it was your dad's idea. That year I went to Australia to teach at the Australian National University in Canberra. They built a glassblowing studio, and Klaus Moyer hired me to be there as the glassblowing instructor for like 3 months. And then I got home from that trip, and I was going to go to Haystack and to Pilchuck, and so I didn't go back to my job. And your dad had given me about a year. He said, why don't you have a show next year? And I was like, all right, but I had no idea what it was going to be. And I made those Whopper vases. And then I still hadn't gone back to my job. And then your dad sold most of them at the opening. Mm-hmm. And then later that month, I won a Tiffany Award, which was, I think, $15,000.
Wow.
So I was like, well, this is going to be easy. That's the only time I've ever sold that much stuff.
The only glassblower who's ever said that in the history of time.
But I never went back to work. I've been unemployed ever since. And
unemployed.
Well, and it's been quite a journey of
How old were you when that?
I was 23.
Wow.
Yeah, when I had that first exhibition, and there was so much hype back then. Glass was just booming, mm-hmm. and I got just a crazy amount of attention. Because it was such a good story, being the son of a guy, and being a youngster and being good at glass blowing really meant something back then. I mean, it still does, but I just got an undue amount of attention. It was a little uncomfortable, to be honest with you, but I rolled with it, and here I am, still working.
Is this, I guess, maybe the 40th anniversary of you showing with the gallery?
I guess you could say that. I hadn't stopped to think about that. But yeah, I'm 61. I was 21 first time I had anything. I was included in that exhibition with Sonia and Lino. Lino's pieces were like $300.
Wow.
He was not a big deal yet.
Yeah.
I mean, he was to me, but he hadn't blossomed, And Benny and Sonia were pretty established people. So it was nice of your dad to include me, but it was also about people who made stuff that was on center. Mm-hmm. So,
which your work continues to be.
Keeping that theme, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's one piece in here that's not on
No,
center.
there's a few things. Yeah, I've loosened up a little bit.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's...
But actually, I mean, a fair number of the pieces that are in this exhibition actually refer back to that original Whopper form.
They do. I kind of fell back onto that shape because I wanted to make there's a limit to how big I can make a pattern. Mm-hmm. And it's essentially what you see here. And I wanted to make the pieces have a little bit more presence. And so I just sort of went back to this. And also having Paul Cunningham come in to help out, that's really familiar to him. He helped me make lots of these in the past. And so I thought it was worth another shot at making them. Everything I did in the beginning was about trying to make compelling forms and then a color field, mm-hmm. And there was a shift. How would I say 20 years ago, I started to tiptoe into making patterns. Working with Lino a lot, he encouraged me, which I thought was curious at the time, but he wanted me to learn how to make a reticello. And I was like, I'm not going to spend all the time to learn how to do that just to make a dragon stem goblet or something. I didn't have an idea mm-hmm. of something. And I learned how to make the reticello, which is really a tricky thing to do. And
sorry to interrupt you,
yeah.
but just for the sake of people watching this, will you explain what reticello is?
A reticello is, I don't remember what the literal translation is, but it's two bubbles put together, one inside of the other, and you do a crisscross like this. And if you do it out of canes, and if you do it right, you trap a bubble in each little square. It's a very traditional Venetian technique.
Very technical.
And it's really tricky. And I had a show at the Traver Gallery sometime in the late 90s, I think it must have been. And because I'm an astute professional, the work was finished before the deadline. And I had another week or so, everything was down at the gallery, and I made a reticello acorn. And I was derided by my focus group, which consisted of my wife at the time and Janusz. We're like, how stupid to make an acorn. And the guys at the cold shop, it was just weird. This,
Should we look at the acorn?
it seemed to me like if I didn't make a glass acorn, somebody else was going to do it. And then your dad called and said, hey, do you have any more of those acorns? A bunch of people want them. So I started making some acorns.
Well, it's an inherently pleasant form to my eye.
I think so.
I,
as a little kid, I was always fascinated. It's this nut that wears a little beret. And I just thought that it was a cool, actually the imagery also comes partly from, as a kid, there was a gumball machine, a vending, gumball machine called Acorn. And it had a really nice little stylized drawing with a 1 cent or a 5 cent or whatever on it that I have in my studio. And I've since I was a kid, I've just always liked that little graphic. And here we are. I make them once in a while when the mood strikes. And that one had been in the works for a long time. I wanted to make a mirrored one. And then the other one that's here, this orange one, was just a really good pattern. I make the pattern first. Mm-hmm. And all this work, the pattern gets made, I can examine it, it goes back into the oven, I pick it up onto a blowpipe and make a piece out of it. Otherwise, you'd spend an entire day making one thing, because it takes all day to make the reticello pattern, and then it takes an hour to make an acorn.
Yeah, so a lot of this work, I've been at the studio, I've seen a lot of this is happening before you're actually blowing.
We only make the pieces like once a month.
Yeah.
And the rest of the time it's Jack and I making ingredients.
Making all the parts and
I came up with this pattern which I called current because of it looks like an electric, like a lightning or something. And also the single most difficult part of this entire artistic process for me is coming up with titles. That's why I've made so many leaf series. And this was an innovation that I came up with. Pretty much everything's been done. And it's just up to you to try to figure out either something that hasn't been done or doing it in a different way. Mm-hmm. And I started with a print series, which I made a few years ago. And I make a rondelle out of canes, pick up a whole mess of cane and twist them and spin it into basically a sheet of glass. And then I just go to town with a glass cutter and assemble it like if I was making a stained glass window.
So you're cutting apart this big rondelle and then reconfiguring it. So you end up with this.
And then picking it up on a blowpipe and making it into the pattern that I'll then use to make the pieces. And I hadn't seen anything like this before, which only means that I just haven't seen it yet. Archimedes Seguso or somebody probably came up with it
at some point.
Yeah, in the 50s. And I don't know, it's kind of an exciting new thing. The work is, a lot of this stuff is sort of driven by the material. And by that I mean like the colors that are available to us. They make ones that you use specifically for pulling cane, and they really hold a line. If you use the normal German color that everybody uses for making everything, that we all have the same palette, the commercially available colors. They don't hold a line. This would just be a big smeary mess. So I've been embracing being able to use the colors that keep the crispy line.
Yeah, so you get a really strong graphic effect. And the other thing that I love that you're doing with this work and the print work, obviously, and the other leaf forms is you're creating this optical space that is really dynamic. And I could see as Deb was filming, I was looking over her shoulder, and you get up close and you see this sort of movement.
Right, that's the idea. And when you make the forms flat, like a lot of these that I've done, it really enhances that. And the print pieces that I did were really inspired directly from the painter Bryce Martin. His Cold Mountain series that he did years back. I always I've liked everything that he did. He was a friend of my uncle's and a mentor to him as well, my Uncle Joseph. And I observed that, he would make a drawing and then he'd put a wash over it, and then he'd make another drawing and put a wash over that. And it resembled this in that, it was two surfaces. But what I can do that he couldn't do is make it do this because it's on glass.
Right, that that sort of moire effect.
Yeah. And it really, in the last 10 years, I've been making more and more pieces like this, and I realized that I'm just essentially making a canvas. You know, I try to do the shape as interestingly as I can, but it's almost an afterthought for the pattern.
It's a surface on which to create Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's something that people have wondered about when they see a show of yours. It's like, oh, well, there are these, Dante's a glass sculptor, but there are these repeated forms, and they're so similar. And I always am trying to draw people's attention to the intricacy of the pattern.
That's what it's all about.
And that the forms, although they are beautiful, elegant, intrinsically pleasing things,
right,
it is about more than that. It's about the pattern, the sort of painterly effect that you get.
That's what, and then also, I mean, at the risk of sounding like, I don't know, a little derogatory, it's you know, the obviousness. I never really embraced the obviousness in glass. Like, I grew up listening to all these hippies talking about how it eats light and it travels through and all this stuff, and I just liked it because you could blow it. You know, I enjoyed the act of being a glass blower, and the early work I made wasn't very glassy.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, you know, like I said, shapes and color fields, and it's really shifted to doing this, you know, taking advantage of what only
glass is good.
Yeah, what is the only thing it could. I mean, these could only be made out of glass.
Yeah.
You know. I'd like to make, and I'm going to try to make a square vessel. It's a tricky thing to do, but it would make a cool.
It would make a very
cool, you know, canvas for patterns.
Would you blow a square vessel?
Yeah. You just have to figure out how to work the corners, and you know, you would do it with freehand. You're going to use a lot of just centrifugal force in the fire, and it's just going to take a bunch of tries, you know, to get it down. I haven't even made an attempt yet. So,
well, let's take a look at some of the other pieces in the show. This is a favorite of mine. Just this bright,
you know,
citron color.
I referenced the German colors that we have available to us, and there used to be 3 different manufacturers in Germany and one in New Zealand, an upstart one in New Zealand, and they all did something really good, but nobody was best. But there was one company that went under about 10 or 15 years ago that made beautiful stuff. Most of the work I've made in my early career was with the Zimmermann color, and I have a stash of it. And there's not much left, but I wanted to use this. It's a favorite of mine, and I'm thrilled somebody liked it enough to own it, because I have a bunch of stuff I've made with this color in my studio still. And the orange that I used is the same thing. It's the same manufacturer, and they just like, the dude made these, the palette just seemed like everything kind of went together. All the different, I mean, that's another example of one of them, and that yellow is too. And, you know, I mean, this is going to sound kind of stupid, but sometimes I just make stuff for me. I'm not thinking about commerce or anything else. I'm just like, I want to make one in that color, and that's what I did. That's basically what I always do.
Yeah.
And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And again, you know, the pattern is just, you can see on the inside, I used a hard green, and then I put this really soft, opaque chartreuse over it. Some people call this yellow. No way.
No.
Yeah, no way. Anyway.
Definitely green.
Yeah.
Bright
it's
green.
a personal favorite.
Green.
Spring green, yeah.
Spring green.
A personal favorite of mine.
Yeah. And then what about the leaf piece on the wall here? So
the
title of the show is
Random Thoughts
in 3 dimensions.
You know, the reason I did that is because, like, I never make a theme. You know, I've had exhibitions where I guess I've introduced like a new series and made the whole show about that. But this work and my practice really is a reflection of my short little span of attention. You know, I have a very diverse product line. I've made a lot of different things because I get bored easily. And years and years ago, I made a series of these leaf pieces that I really wanted to work with powder. I had worked with the artist William Morris on his team a little bit, and everything he did was sifting powder. It's a nasty process, you know, because it gets everywhere and it's bad for you and whatnot. And I wanted to do so. And so I made these objects a long time ago. And then this particular acorn came back to the studio, and this piece was on the wall in my studio, and I set this down on the only flat surface I could find at the time. And it just went with the nut, with the leaf. So here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, it's fun. It's fun to see. It's sort of an entry point into your creative process and your mind in a way. I mean, experimentation is part of what you do.
Absolutely.
Playing and
that's
trying new things and
absolutely. And I mean, I'm not as good at it as a lot of people, but I do mess around, you know, and like it's hard to put your finger on it really, but I guess before the camera was rolling, we talked about it being about experience. And, you know, there's going to be people who are whose fingers work better than mine, you know, better at glass blowing. But I've been doing this for a long time, and there's no substitute. There really aren't any shortcuts for becoming proficient at working with glass like this. You just have to put in the years, you know, and have the failures and, you know, and the successes, of course, as well, that you can fall back on. You know, that part of it gets overlooked. And people want to get good at making goblets or whatever. But there's a lot more to this. If you want to be an artist, you really have to fail a bunch before you make the good stuff. And I really, you know, I can't really overstate the importance of Pilchuck Glass School. You know, that's sort of my alma mater. And it would be a little bit of a stretch to say everything I learned at Pilchuck, but not too much of a stretch, you know, like working here in town with Benjamin Moore as a youngster through the years at his studio with all the great people that came through was a big part of my development. But then my summers spent at the school, I don't, like I said, I can't overstate how important that place is to development.
What do you think it is about Pilchuck that is, I mean, glass is sort of based on this apprenticeship model, and it's hard to kind of conceive of ever getting away from that because, as you say, like it is just time spent teaching your hands and your body how to do this work. But there is something distinct about what happens at Pilchuck that's outside of that. You know,
I think the biggest thing about it is that everybody that's there is working with the same stuff. Whether you're up in a different building, kiln forming, or in the cold shop grinding, or down in the hot shop blowing glass, we're all there with working with the same stuff. There's other schools like the Haystack School or Penland that have multi-discipline, you know, different crafts in them and stuff. But Pilchuck, everybody is just a glass head that's there. And what goes on in the hot shop is like this big circus. You know, there's like 15, 20 people all working at the same time in there, students and the TAs and the teachers and whatnot. And you just get to be immersed in all this activity. You know, it's just the best place to see a lot of stuff all at once, you know. And then the biggest thing about it is that anybody who's any good at this stuff has been to Pilchuck. You kids all got to come to Pilchuck. And without exception. You know, Lino, everyone.
Yeah, for
sure.
You know,
I mean, I think that Lino would agree with me that it was a big part of his development as well.
For sure. I mean, I think when I think back on like Lino's career and coming from Italy and the factory setting, and then coming to Pilchuck where it's about experimentation and young artists working with, you know, older artists who have experience and like this sort of cross-pollination of ideas and just seeing, and just so much seeing.
Yeah, seeing is exactly right. And I think that Lino and his brother-in-law Keiko, who came before him to Pilchuck in the late 70s, were really taken with the passion that a bunch of young hippie kids had for doing this, because it's not necessarily like that where they come from. Everybody on the island of Murano works with glass, but they're not all passionate about it. And anybody that goes to Pilchuck is making an effort. You know, it's not easy to get to go there. It's the passion that we all have for glass making is what that place is all about. I guess that's kind of an obvious thing to say, but it's really the truth. You know, and it just keeps coming. They just keep They just keep making more enthusiastic people that want to do this. So
Pretty amazing.
yeah.
Well, Dante, thank you so much for sharing your insights on this show and for the really beautiful exhibition of new work.
Thank you.
This show is up through the month of May, and I encourage you all to come and see it in person. There's many more beautiful pieces than we were able to highlight here. And if you can't come in person, check it out online. Thanks for watching. Thanks,
Thank
Dante.
you. Thanks very much. That was easy.